Saturday night in.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak.
Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Today we're exploring the NHS. Are nurses right to go on strike over Christmas, or are they miserly Scrooges? Do they have legitimate concerns? We'll explore that in a moment. Also, migration numbers, 500,000 people. Can the country cope? And what were the best campaigns of the last 10 years? A bit of a twist there at the end. We'll explore it all after the headlines. Oh, hello.
Jones in the GB newsroom. The Health Secretary is refusing to back down over nurses' pay demands ahead of their first national strike in over a century. Steve Barclay says he can't agree to a massive 17.6% pay rise. Instead, he's open to discussing how working lives can be improved. The Royal College of Nursing accused the government of rejecting formal talks as an alternative to industrial action. As a result, staff in England, Wales and Northern Ireland will walk out for 2 days on the 15th and 20th of December. A 6-year-old child has died after a bacteria outbreak at a school in Surrey. A second child is being treated in hospital. The UK Health Security Agency has confirmed it was an invasive Group A streptococcal infection, also known as Strep A, which causes scarlet fever. Pupils and staff at Ashford Church of England Primary School have since been prescribed antibiotics. A man charged with the murders of a mother and 2 children in Nottingham is due to appear in court today. Jamie Barrow is charged with the murders of Fatimata Hidara and her daughters, aged 3 and 1. They died from smoke inhalation during a fire at their flat in Clifton on Sunday. Energy regulator Ofgem has proposed changes to protect customers and ensure suppliers are more resilient. They include the introduction of capital requirements so that companies have the funds to deal with market shocks. It's after soaring energy prices forced many small providers out of business. Ofgem also wants suppliers to help households by closely monitoring credit balances and identifying vulnerable customers. Royal Mail workers are striking for a second consecutive day. The Communication Workers Union has rejected the company's final pay offer and more industrial actions planned in the coming weeks. CWU General Secretary Dave Ward says the union will continue the fight for jobs.
They are talking about destroying the Royal Mail as we know it today. They want to turn Royal Mail into just another parcel courier, and we're not going to accept that. This is an important part of the UK's infrastructure. We believe the public will support this dispute. We're in this situation because of gross mismanagement of the CEO and the board of Royal Mail, and we need a government inquiry now to look into the actions of the board.
And Wales are chasing an historic World Cup victory in Qatar, with their match kicking off against Iran in just under half an hour's time. Tonight, England will be seeking 3 points to secure the team's place in the knockout stages. Lions manager Gareth Southgate urging his players to think big ahead of their game against the USA, which kicks off at 7 p.m. in Cardiff. Fans told us what it means to see Wales play in their first World Cup since 1958.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Obviously, we don't get this. We've been lucky. We've had 2 Euros, but our first World Cup. So 64 years. It's great. That's why we're out at 9 o'clock in the morning for. Good to go.
Yeah, excited. It's great to see our country in the World Cup. So, yeah, it's brilliant.
And what's your plan today?
Go out and watch a football. Hopefully, watch a win and have a couple of beers.
I think we're going to smash on.
And what's the score prediction from you?
3-0 to Wales.
OK, easy peasy in the bag. Good luck.
And best of luck to both teams. TV online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom.
A very good morning. It's 9:35 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, as I'm supposed to be in camera this morning. The Royal College of Nursing has announced its members will stage their first ever walkout on the 15th and the 20th of December. Now, it's due to an ongoing dispute with the government over pay. The strike will involve RCN, Royal College of Nursing members, in more than half of the hospitals and community teams in the country. But emergency care, they say, will still be staffed. Well, how are we defining emergency care, and just what are going to be the implications of this strike? Well, Alice Porter is outside the Royal College of Nursing in central London and joins us now. Alice, firstly, what's brought about this strike?
Well, the Royal College of Nursing say that this industrial action is happening because they claim that the government refused to sit down and negotiate with them, and that's why they're saying that they're going to be striking, and that's going to be strikes that are taking place in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, not in Scotland, because negotiations are still ongoing there. And this is very much an ongoing dispute that they're having with the government over pay. The nurses are demanding, according to Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, a pay rise of about 19%. They're wanting that very much, they're arguing, in line with inflation. Now, nurses were given a pay rise in the summer of about 4.75%, a little bit more for those on a lower income, but the Royal College of Nursing say that's not enough, particularly for more experienced nurses, and then a number of economists have also agreed with that, and they're saying that actually they've had, in real terms, a 20% pay cut. So that's why they're wanting more than that, and that's why we're having these strikes. They're going to be taking place on the 15th and 20th of December. And of course, those dates in the run-up to Christmas will be very alarming to a lot of people who are booked in for perhaps any outpatient treatment. I mean, the good news at least is that emergency care will still be staffed. We're still waiting. We'll hopefully hear within the next week about which areas are going to be impacted. But of course, anybody who is in the run-up to Christmas, when of course we've got winter pressures, we know about the enormous backlog, it's going to be really concerning for any patient who's going to be going there. But the Royal College of Nursing are saying that there are so many unfulfilled vacancies. In fact, they say 25,000 nurses and midwives left the council register over the last year, and they're very much making the economic argument that it doesn't make sense for the government to be spending billions of pounds a year plugging those workforce gaps with agency staff. So that's very much the argument coming from the nurses, but the government is saying what they're suggesting. They're claiming that it's a pay of 19% pay rise. They're saying that would be 10 billion a year, and they say that simply it's not affordable.
Yeah, 19%. I don't know any sector that's getting a 19% pay rise. This is clearly a very tricky situation and very, very worrying for those who don't know whether their care would be classed as essential or not. Let's hope they come out very, very soon and clarify what they're classing as essential or otherwise. But just finally, are more strikes than these 2 days on the cards? Are more strikes potentially coming about with other healthcare workers?
Yes, that's right. Today the ballot closes for Unison members, and next week there'll be a ballot closing for Unite for NHS workers, and that's the largest health union in the country. So that will be significant. We've got ballots for strikes for physiotherapists, for midwives, and potentially junior doctors next year as well. So this is a really alarming picture of the NHS, and of course unions will say, well, we've been saying this for months and months. We've got a workforce that are exhausted from the pandemic, who are struggling with the cost of living. And of course, it becomes a chicken and egg situation. More and more people continue to leave the profession. It makes it harder for the ones who are there. And the worry is of how that's impacting on patient care. Of course, the counter argument will be from those perhaps who are in the private sector will say, well, we haven't had a pay rise. People may have lost their job in the pandemic, being furloughed. I literally had 10 minutes ago someone come up to me as a painter and sort of said, well, I can't strike as I wouldn't make any money. And so I suppose that's the difficulty, that's the conundrum. But I think that for the government, what is so significant about these strikes in particular is how emotive it is. Anything with the NHS is always emotive. I mean, we can just see the placards now with nurses. It's going to be very, very emotional. It's very symbolic to have nurses striking for the first time in history. And while, of course, there are competing strikes at the moment, I think really when it comes to public opinion, many people will be, I think it's fair to say, siding their sympathies with NHS workers who do, of course, an enormous amount of good work in the country. And it will be a real blow for the government with winter pressures piling on as we get to the end of the year.
Yeah, a really tricky situation for the NHS as a whole. Those waiting lists growing all the time as well. What a fine mess. Well, Alice Porter, thank you for joining us there outside the Royal College of Nursing with the latest on that pretty seismic story. So, 2 days of strikes from nurses over Christmas, and that could just be the start. The government must really be starving the NHS of funding, right? Right? Well, let's look at the numbers. This is from the independent health experts at the King's Fund, adjusted for inflation. In 2009, we spent £116 billion on the NHS. Now, by next year, we'll be spending £174 billion on the NHS. That is a 50% real terms increase on NHS funding. But if there's been so much more money going into the NHS, where has that money gone? Why does it not feel like there's been more money in the NHS? Well, we've got more nurses. From 2010 to 2021, the number of people per nurse fell from 166 to 161. The number of people per GP fell from 1,312 to 1,246. The number of people per medical or dental staff fell from 507 to 417. That's all data from the independent Nuffield Trust. And it shows that even with population increases, there are more nurses, doctors, and other healthcare professionals per citizen. So more doctors, more nurses, more money. What is there less of? Well, that's a question that was posed by Ben Zaranko, an economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He said that even compared to 2019, spending is 12% higher on the NHS. There are 13% more doctors, 10% more consultants, 11% more nurses, and 10% more clinical support staff. So why doesn't it feel like there are? More staff and more money over the last 3 years, indeed more money and more staff over the previous decade too. And yet services are getting worse. Waiting times are appalling. Why is all this money and all these staff not making things better? Well, here is perhaps a part of the answer. While cash and clinical staff has been rising, in one area staff have been severely cut. The number of managerial staff. In 2009, that sat at 42,509. By 2021, there were just 33,531. That's a drop of 25% in managerial staff. So why does that matter? Well, while it's politically popular to say we should have more and more frontline staff at the expense of the backroom, in reality that leads to huge inefficiencies within the system. More doctors and nurses doing their own paperwork instead of treating patients. deployed to the wrong places without enough logistics staff to say where they'd be most effective. A clogged-up system devoid of specialisation, where medical staff spend too long inputting data on their terrible IT systems and not properly deployed for their own skill sets. Yes, what other sector, what other employer would not have that investment in logistics? Well, I'm going to say something politically unpopular. Even when adjusted per head of population, the NHS, of course, has never had more money, never had more doctors, never had more nurses. But before we say it's time to pour ever more billions of taxpayer cash into the system, we might need to look at the least populist answer that I could possibly think of. Perhaps, just perhaps, the NHS needs more middle managers. Well, of course, related to this issue of pressure on the NHS is, of course, the migration numbers that we've seen this week. 500,000 people added to the United Kingdom population in the year to June. I'm delighted to be joined now by the political editor of the Daily Express, David Maddox. And David, first of all, I suppose to some extent these numbers weren't a huge surprise. We know that we've taken on 100,000 plus Ukrainians, 100,000 plus Hong Kongers fleeing tyranny. To some extent, this was an aberrational year. But what was your reaction to those numbers we saw yesterday?
I think the problem is that it feeds into a bigger picture of a government that's just lost control of the borders issue. And that's the trouble. And yes, absolutely, you know, we needed to be taking those people from Hong Kong. We needed to be taking those people from Ukraine. You know, these were very special circumstances. Hong Kong, in particular, I think we owed legacy reasons for those people to come here for protection. But it's this bigger picture, and you know that was obviously legal migration. But on the other hand, you know we have the problem of illegal migration coming across the channel, and there's just this wider perspective that the government that promised to take back control of our borders with Brexit has singularly failed to do so in any regard.
Do you think that Rishi Sunak, when he answers these questions about the level of migration, and he says in a phrase that we've come to know quite well, he needs to deal with illegal migration first before thinking about the numbers of legal migration, do you think that that's a sort of soundbite that will land well with the people of the United Kingdom?
I think people have just numbed to it now, actually. I think, you know, we've had 12 years of Conservative leaders and prime ministers promising to tackle illegal migration and bring down legal migration. I mean, right back to David Cameron setting targets. I think it was 100,000 net for David Cameron on legal migration. You know, we've just had, you know, Theresa May said it, Boris Johnson said it, now Rishi's saying it. People have stopped believing it. I mean, certainly we've run a couple of polls lately, and the degree of scepticism to migration control measures is huge. You know, we're talking about 6 in 10, 7 in 10 voters. And you know, the problem is I think people want to sort of stop hearing words and actually just see some actual action, you know, instead of their local hotels jam-packed with illegal migrants, for example.
Yeah, I think the really evocative thing here is the sense of a lack of control over that illegal migration higher than we've ever had recorded. Perhaps 50,000 this year coming in small boats with no sort of control or process there. But if we look at the detail of the legal migration numbers we saw yesterday, the Office for National Statistics released not this graphic. If we could just get to the next graphic first, which is from the Office for National Statistics, which just showed the difference of the levels of migration. 150,000 coming for work, but considerably higher numbers coming for student visas. See there, the light blue line. Those coming to study was the largest number, around 270,000 people. And if we go to the next graphic now, we can see that actually, amongst the British public, very few people think that students, who come, of course, for 3 years or so and then mostly leave again, very few people think that those numbers should be included in the overall migration total. So perhaps, are we looking at this the wrong way? That 500,000 number, if we don't look at students within it, perhaps that's actually quite a bit lower.
That was one of the arguments Theresa May regularly put forward, that we should just take the student numbers out of this, and that would actually bring the figures down to a more realistic migration total. There was always a great deal of scepticism about that, because actually many of the students then stay on and find work and so forth. It was very hard to actually track who was staying on and who was not staying on. I noticed yesterday that Rishi Sunak was actually talking about cutting the number of student visas, which is, potentially a way to deal with it, actually. I mean, I know the university sector loves the money coming in from abroad, so, there's some balance to be had there. But what that graph also shows is this idea that we need massive migration for the jobs and for economic growth is questionable in that sense. If a majority of them are coming, or a large proportion of them coming for education reasons as opposed to work reasons, then it perhaps questions the model of the people who are proposing and supporting open borders.
Yes, I suppose it also points to the fact that only 150,000 out of that 500,000 are coming for those jobs under the new points-based system. Perhaps that explains, to some extent, some of those labour shortages that we're seeing. It's not actually 500,000 people coming to plug skills gaps. It's only 150,000 coming to plug skills gaps. A really interesting breakdown there. I wonder what's the next step, though. It seems that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are now so similar, both on the issue of migration. They're saying sort of the same platitudes as they did at the start of this week at the Confederation of British Industry. Is there really a cigarette paper that we can put between both parties on this?
No, I mean, Keir Starmer's definitely moved to the right on this issue in terms of his rhetoric. But again, if you look at the small print, he's still offering more work visas. And again, as I say, I think platitudes is the right way to put it. We've had 12 years of Conservative governments and Conservative leaders, Home Secretaries, saying that they're going to bring this under control and reduce it. And in fact, what's happened is we're getting record numbers. I mean, we're 500,000 people. We're talking about a couple of Coventries, aren't we? Each year, and that's an enormous amount to try and house, to try and provide services for, when we're already struggling anyway. I mean, your previous section on what's going on with the NHS is, this all feeds into the strain on public services, despite the extra investment, despite the extra doctors and nurses. It's, this is part of a problem in the country. The country is creaking in terms of what it can offer people in terms of services, in terms of housing, and and the whole cost of living issue. So they've got to stop with the words and actually tackle the problem in the end, or else others are going to start moving into a political void that's been left by the main parties.
Yeah, it's interesting to see Nigel Farage making more and more sort of hints towards returning to that arena. We'll have to watch this space. But for now, David Maddox, political editor of the Daily Express, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this morning. Really interesting stuff there. Well, finally today, footballer Marcus Rashford's Free School Meals initiative. Remember that? Well, it's been named the best campaign of the past decade. That's according to the results of a poll conducted by Pagefield. The Vote Leave campaign also placed in the top 10, alongside Sarah's Law, spearheaded by the News of the World. But what is the issue around these political campaigns? Have outside campaigns, in many ways, become more influential than elected politicians' own words. Well, I'm joined now by Oliver Foster, CEO of Pagefield, to dive into these results. And Oliver, thank you for joining us this morning. Were you surprised by some of the results on this list? Some of these campaigns that, of course, were sort of extra-parliamentary have really been more defining of the last decade than things that have gone on inside Parliament.
No, morning, Tom. Thanks for having me. No, not surprised really, because all of the top 10 were pretty high-profile public campaigns at the time over the last decade, and we were really determined when we selected the top 50 that was then down selected by a panel of judges to the top 10. We really wanted to put it out to a public vote, and as you said up front, the top three were quite close in the end. Vote Leave came in at about 15% of the vote. Sarah's Law at 18% and Marcus Rashford, Free School Meals at 20%. So there was quite a closeness between the three. But what unites them all really is a authenticity and a mobilisation of support that all three campaigns, in very different ways, were very good at doing. All of them engaged politicians, and many of them had some high-profile politicians backing them. But I think your question is an interesting one, really, about the power of outside influence. And the beginning of your programme, you were talking about the NHS. And of course, one of the best groups of campaigners and arguably well-funded campaigners are the trade unions. And they have been for many years. And so campaigning is not just about big corporates with deep pockets. It's charities, it's trade unions, it's individuals. And our list of the top 10 that was voted on includes a mix of all of those.
Do you think that, to some extent, more political power is now sort of more dispersed than at any point before? It's interesting looking at the last sort of 2 months in British politics. One Prime Minister unable to get her agenda through Parliament and then being defenestrated as Prime Minister, perhaps due to outside pressure. This Prime Minister now feeling the heat on various levelling up legislation too. Perhaps sort of campaigning groups outside Parliament have more power than ever before.
Potentially, but I think what's more interesting is to look at politicians themselves. You still have some good, high-profile politicians who are very good campaigners. Robert Halford is a very good example of someone who has spent many years campaigning on certain issues and becoming an expert. Your own Nigel Farage was instrumental in Vote Leave. There are a good pocket of politicians who are still good at that. Sadly, I think our political class is no longer as good as it used to be overall in campaigning, which is why outside bodies are having much more impact. But the key with all of this is that if you are authentic, if you mobilise, if you have data-driven campaigns, you're going to succeed because the public will be persuaded of your case. If you are just throwing money at it with no real sense of your direction or indeed your evidence, then you're not going to succeed.
Well, it's an absolutely fascinating list and well worth checking out for those who have not yet seen it in full. Rashford, Sarah's Law and Vote Leave coming in at the top there. Oliver Foster, CEO of Pagefield, thank you for talking us through campaigning as a modern political force. Well, that's it for the programme today. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll be back on Monday from 9:30. But up next, here's a look at the weather.
Good morning, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office. A bright and breezy Friday out there today. Sunny spells for most, and not much in the way of rain. We certainly had a lot of wet and windy weather over the past 48 hours from a couple of weather fronts in this low pressure system. But here, this little bump in the isobars is what we call a little ridge, and that will bring, as I say, most of us a fine day. Not everywhere. Still in the west, there are a few showers feeding in parts of South Wales, Southwest England this morning, Northwest England too, and we'll keep showers going over the Highlands and the Western Isles through the day. Some will just get through the Central Belt and perhaps into parts of Aberdeenshire, but I say for many it will be dry and bright with some decent spells of sunshine. Still a bit breezy, but nothing like as lively as the winds have been. And temperatures responding to a bit of sunshine, double figures almost across the board. Maybe only 8 or 9 in the eastern parts of Scotland, but in the south we could see highs of 13 Celsius, pretty mild for the time of year. It will turn quite cold quite quickly this evening if you're heading out. Most places will be dry. Still the odd shower for West Wales, northwest England, but I say most places will be dry. Some wet weather will keep going across the far north of Scotland. With those lighter winds and clearer skies, it will turn quite chilly with frost in certainly rural areas over the Midlands and eastern England to start the weekend. Further west, though, the breeze will be picking up and the next weather system will be on the way, bringing rain to Northern Ireland initially on Saturday morning, but it will spread to parts of western Scotland and by lunchtime into parts of Wales and western England too. I suspect much of the Midlands, eastern England, some parts of Aberdeenshire won't see any rain until quite late in the day, and much of East Anglia and the southeast will stay dry, certainly until after sunset. It will be turning windy though during tomorrow, the wind's steadily picking up, but it is going to bring mild air with it, so temperatures in the teens, as they could be on Sunday. There could also be some stubborn rain across East Anglia and the southeast on Sunday. Some question marks about that, but elsewhere looking a little brighter.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
On the Mark Stein Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Stein Show.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Monday to Thursday, 10 till 12, on TV, on radio and online.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart, and I'd invite you to join me at noon on Saturdays and Sundays for Alastair Stewart and Friends. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Now, here at GB News, I've never been happier. I get to choose the big stories that really interest me. We hear what you have to say, and you hear what I have to say. I really hope you can join me, noon on Saturdays and Sundays.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Good morning, it's Friday morning with Esther
Alistair and Phil. But we've got a cracking show lined up for you today. We'll be joined by Lord Sumption discussing the cost of lockdowns, because it seems to me so many people are still in denial from the impacts of lockdown, particularly the expense, 400 billion there will be a fallout. And Ben Bradley MP on the lack of male role models in the classroom, and a hospitality expert to explain how the winter strikes will impact that industry.
We'll also be joined throughout the show by the former Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, and Conservative Councillor for Epping, Holly Whitbread. But first, let's get the latest news headlines with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Philip. It's